Welcome to the Hunchcast, where we discuss all things the Hunchback of Notre Dame. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Leslie. And today, we're discussing the opera La Esmeralda, which premiered in Paris in 1836, with music by composer Louise Bertin and words by Victor Hugo himself. This opera was not the first adaptation ever made of Hugo's novel Notre-Dame de Paris, aka The Hunchback of Notre Dame, but it is significant in that it is the only adaptation Victor Hugo himself participated in creating, which is a huge testament to his faith in the composer, Louise Bertin, a young, disabled woman writing operas at a time when the barrier to entry for female composers to have their work performed publicly was quite high.
We recently sat down with musicologist Dr. Denise Boneau, the world's leading expert in Louise Bertin's life and legacy, whose PhD thesis revived interest in Bertin's work. We are so grateful that she took the time to sit down for an interview with us, which we're releasing next week as a special episode, so keep an eye out for that one, listener.
But before we dive into this opera and talk about how it differs from Victor Hugo's novel and how it influenced future adaptations, it's time for today's Minute of History. Patrick, who was Louise Bertin? I have a bachelor's in music. Earning that degree required me to take quite a few music history courses. This composer's name came up in exactly 0 of the lectures I attended. So who was she? And what was it about her that made Victor Hugo say, you know what? I want you to be the first composer to adapt my best-selling novel into an opera. And you know what? I believe in you so much that I will work on it with you.
Well, the answer to both of those questions, Leslie, is the same. Good old nepotism. Louise Bertin was a family friend to the Hugos, and Louise's father was a notable newspaper publisher. He published a paper called the Journal des Débats, which was very supportive of the current government after the Revolution of 1830. They were seen as kind of the establishment paper, and Mr. Bertin was a bit of a mentor to Hugo. And Hugo also really liked his daughter. Now, not in the same way that Victor Hugo liked most women. This was, as far as we know, purely platonic. And in Victor Hugo's wife's biography of him, she states that Hugo agreed to work with Louise simply out of friendship. And Victor had the most prominent composers in Europe asking to do an adaptation of Notre-Dame de Paris. Now, by the time Louise asked Victor to adapt his novel into an opera, there had been a few adaptations for the stage, but nothing on the scale of a grand opera, which was the most prestigious theatrical art form at the time.
Yeah, listener, a grand opera is a subgenre of opera originating in Paris in the 19th century. It usually features 4 or 5 acts of music, spectacular stagecraft, a ballet, a huge chorus, opulent costumes, usually having to do with some royal or noble characters. Just think of the most grand spectacle you could possibly see on a stage. That's a grand opera.
And the master of grand opera was a composer named Meyerbeer, who wrote operas like Robert le Diable, which has a great medieval setting, very similar to Notre-Dame de Paris. He asked Hugo if he could collaborate on an opera. Hugo says no. Another composer, Rossini, asks to collaborate on an opera. Hugo rejects him again. Hugo doesn't want to play the role of second fiddle. And in opera, the person who writes the words is considered the lesser partner to the person who writes the music. They're the subordinate partner. And so, why does Hugo agree to work with Louise? I think his wife is correct by saying it's out of friendship. But I think it's also a little bit of the fact that Louise was not a prominent celebrity. She wouldn't put herself above Hugo and make him a subordinate partner. They could be more equals when working together. And they hit the ground running in a bit of a patchwork collaboration process. Hugo had a few outlines of the plot, that differ pretty considerably from the version of the opera that actually ended up getting produced. These storylines hewed a bit closer to the book, with plot lines like Esmeralda's long-lost mother, and a larger role for Quasimodo, who, in the final version, is basically a cameo role. He has one good aria and just stands around most of the time.
We'll get into the plot of this opera in a minute, listener.
And I say this is a patchwork of a creative process because Hugo would write individual scenes that he and Louise wanted to put in the opera, usually derived from the novel. And after writing a few verses, he would send them off to Louise. Louise would give her criticism and feedback if it would work for her music. And if the changes were applied and everything was right, she would compose her music accordingly. Yes, he wants to be more of an equal, but Hugo knows he's not the most important collaborator here. And he has his tongue in his cheek about that. In this letter to Louise in 1833, Hugo writes, "Here, mademoiselle, is Quasimodo's song. I made it about as gay as I could, but it seems impossible to be entirely jolly. You be the judge of that. Your musical sense, after all, must be sovereign, and my rhymes are but the very humble servants of your notes."
Was that sarcastic or sincere?
I think a little bit of both. And Hugo rarely complained when Louise offered a suggestion. He was always willing to work with her and make changes with regard to syllable counts or the types of poems he would submit as the lyrics to the opera. And despite Paris being the home of grand opera, La Esmeralda is not going to be very grand by the time it gets produced. There are a ton of budget cuts and concerns because the opera at this time is run by the government. Now, because of Louise's father being a prominent newspaper man that favors the government, she's able to get her foot in the door, but not much beyond that. She's not very popular at the opera houses and with the government officials who keep demanding changes and cuts to the story. And eventually, the 5-act grand opera gets cut down to 4 acts. And it just keeps getting cut down further and further and further. This really seems to dishearten Victor Hugo, who liked this grand vision. There were supposed to be 15 tableaux or sets with elaborate backdrops and props, but that just got cut down further and further. And by the end of the production, I get the sense that he's very disheartened and disillusioned with the whole process. But it's very different for Louise. She's not exactly disheartened, but she is made by the new managers of the opera house to feel like the entire weight of the world is on her shoulders. If her opera doesn't succeed, people will lose their jobs, and she will have humiliated and destroyed the lives of so many people. And she writes a really sad letter to Victor asking for his help because he's a celebrity, he's a strong-willed person, and she's a very meek person. You know, not just because she's a person with disabilities, but also she's trying to make her career. Victor Hugo already has a career. All the big opera singers she's working with have a career. She's just trying to make it. She had a few operas written before this, but none of them were successful. You know, the best criticism she got was for an opera about a werewolf where somebody said that it was good for a woman. And near the end of production, Louise writes a letter to Victor saying, "Oh, please come to my aid, monsieur. From all sides, I am told I am making a big mistake not to take my turn. They show me a frightening future. Come tell me what I should do." And Hugo replied to this letter, more or less telling her to do her best. He's getting disillusioned, especially by some of the censorship that's going to take place.
Oh, do tell.
Well, you know how in the novel, Claude Frollo's whole MO is that he's a priest who becomes a demon?
Not only is he a priest, he is the Archdeacon of Notre-Dame Cathedral, an immensely powerful position within the clergy at the time.
Well, during the 1830s, if you had an opera produced, you had to submit the libretto to a government censorship committee.
The libretto meaning the words of the opera or the lyrics. Libretto literally translates in Italian to little book. It's the lyrics of the opera, what we would call the book in musical theater.
And the censorship committee has a few problems.
Is the censorship committee operating through the government or through the opera house where this opera is premiering?
Both, because the opera house is run by the government.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I've heard plenty of horror stories about French bureaucracy, but this story seems to take the cake. Hugo submits the libretto. Things seem fine at first, but then the word priest is considered problematic. So the censorship committee comes up with a compromise. Claude Frollo can be depicted as a priest doing priest stuff, but you can't use the word priest.
So the audience can put two and two together subtextually, but you can't use the term priest explicitly, because I guess the government at the time didn't want to deal with the implication that a clergyman could be a bad person or could be the antagonist of a story.
So Hugo goes and revises his libretto, cutting out the word priest. Mind you, there's no Control F back then. He's having to do this with like an inkwell, so I imagine it's got to be a huge pain.
He had kids, have them do it.
Well, he already put his daughter to work. Louise was so nervous when writing to Hugo, even though they were friends, that all of their business correspondence was addressed to Hugo's little daughter.
Oh, I have some friends I'm afraid of, I understand.
Hugo submits the censored version of the libretto, with all of the changes that the government wanted. And it's not good enough. Now the government censorship committee has changed its mind. Actually, it's not enough that you just cut the word priest. You can't show him as a priest either, because that is blasphemous. Oh, and also, by the way, Notre-Dame de Paris has been put on the Catholic Index Librorum Prohibitorum. I think I'm saying that right.
Yeah, English, please.
It's the list of books that are banned by the Catholic Church, so if you read them, you're going to hell.
See you there, babe.
So not only is the word priest banned, not only can Claude Frollo not be depicted as a priest, but you can't even title the opera after the famous novel for marketing purposes.
Wait. So the opera house where this huge grand opera was being performed, they weren't even allowed to market this opera as a stage adaptation, the first authorized stage adaptation of Victor Hugo's best-selling novel, because government censors said, actually, that's blasphemous, you can't do that.
Yeah, you can't have an opera named after a cathedral. So that's why the title is changed to La Esmeralda, fairly late in development. And to be honest, there were a lot of changes very late in development. And there's a lot of last-minute rewrites, not just with the libretto, but with the music. Music composition is not a fast process. So I imagine Louise was putting in a lot of late hours, and I really feel for her.
And I can imagine there would be a ton of pressure on someone in that situation, not just having the biggest project of your career performed publicly at the forefront of society. You know, this is being performed at the Paris Opera House, which is funded by the government. Everyone who is everyone is going to be there. I can imagine this is also extremely stressful for Louise as a woman. Drawing on my music history education here, Bertin was not the first woman to write an opera. She wasn't even the first woman to write an opera that saw a public performance. And there were a few female composers in the 19th century. You might have heard the names Clara Schumann, Fanny Mendelssohn, although those composers are better known by their relationship to their husbands, first and foremost, who were also famous composers, which just goes to show that composition was largely seen at this time as a male pursuit. The Paris Conservatory of Music did not admit women into its composition program. But because the Bertin family was so wealthy and so well connected, Louise's father was able to hire a professor from the conservatory to come to the Bertin family home and teach Louise privately. So Because of her family's wealth and connections, they were able to circumvent those sexist admissions policies, and she was more or less able to get the same education as a man. Nowadays, we would refer to her as a Nepo baby. That's okay. You know, being a Nepo baby doesn't necessarily mean you're a talentless hack. Laura Dern was a Nepo baby. Jeff Bridges was a Nepo baby. Carrie Fisher was a Nepo baby. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And as I mentioned, she was disabled. She became very ill as a child. We don't know exactly what illness it was, but it did paralyze her from the waist down. She could walk with the help of a cane, but she did rely on a wheelchair most of the time. At the time, this would have unfortunately more or less obliterated her marriage prospects. But as Dr. Denise Boneau, the world's leading expert on Bertin's life and legacy, suggests, there may have been an upside to this. It might have meant that Louise didn't have to focus on honing the domestic sciences. She didn't have to focus on making herself into a suitable wife for whatever wealthy suitor happened to come along. She could just put her head down and fuel all of her time and energy into her studies. So yeah, her mobility was limited for the rest of her life, but there might have been a silver lining to that compositionally. So she was getting a really great education, and we'll talk about her compositional prowess in a moment. But at the time, a woman who composed music was not always seen as a composer. She was seen as a female composer. If you were a woman and you wanted to have a career in music, you could learn to sing, you could learn an instrument. That's really it. You know, the idea of a composer being a woman and being successful and having her work performed on the biggest stage in Paris wasn't unheard of necessarily, but it was quite uncommon. So Hugo's submitting his libretto. He and Louise have to make a million cuts. The grand 5-act spectacle that they have envisioned probably won't see the light of day, but they're trying to salvage it as best they can. Where do we go from there?
You know, Louise is trying her best to salvage it. I think that Hugo was largely losing interest and was frustrated by this point.
As you mentioned, he was Victor Hugo. He had a ton of other writing projects he was probably working on simultaneously, whereas this opera was the center of Louise's universe. She had not become a household name at this point. She was just the woman adapting Notre-Dame de Paris who was trying to make a name for herself, whereas Victor Hugo was already Victor Hugo and was a wealthy man, in demand, had a million other things to worry about. I don't blame him for getting kind of distracted and losing interest.
He's on vacation while rehearsals start, and rehearsals are not going well. First of all, Louise can't really direct a lot of the rehearsals herself because of her disability, so she brings in a friend and fellow romantic, Hector Berlioz.
Yes, a prominent composer of French melodies.
And Hector Berlioz was not Berlioz yet. He was a composer and had done a few things, but his star was not yet on the rise. He had not yet done his Symphonie Fantastique or his take on Faust, which some argue is even better than the more famous version by Charles Gounod, also a Frenchman. He was in this romantic circle. He's directing rehearsals, and a lot of the singers really are not putting much effort into their performances. They're basically yawning through the choruses. The main singers are doing a good job. Thank the Lord for nepotism, because they got some of the most prominent singers in the opera company. Esmeralda's played by a famous singer named Corneille Falcon. And the guy playing Phoebus is a bit of a prima donna. He is always complaining that his part is too small. So anyhow, rehearsals are not going well. The chorus actors are yawning and being boring, and this really annoys Berlioz. Victor Hugo is on vacation during most of the rehearsals, but when he finally comes back, he's really disheartened and disappointed. He looks at the costumes for the vagabonds and is like, what the heck? These guys look like they're wearing brand new fabrics. They don't look like vagabonds at all. He thinks the set looks cheap and lame. He tries to offer his own creative suggestions for how the opera could be directed in a more interesting way. Everything is dismissed, and it all comes to a head in November of 1836. The premiere begins, the curtain rises, and the audience seems to start enjoying the show, until there's a couple rumblings going on. I mentioned earlier that Quasimodo has a very small part, but his piece, the Bell Song, or the Air de Cloche, is regarded as probably the most original and best piece in the opera. So that piece starts in the fourth act, and people in the crowd start shouting and complaining. It's not by Mademoiselle Bertin, it's by Berlioz. She's a plagiarist. And you know who one of the most prominent hecklers was?
Who?
Alexandre Dumas.
The guy who wrote the Three Musketeers?
He wrote the plot outline for the Three Musketeers, and then someone else actually wrote it.
Yeah, if I know anything about Dumas, it's that he relied very heavily on ghostwriters, which is fine. I myself have ghostwritten books before. It's part of my job. The problem is that Dumas didn't pay his ghostwriters royalties, and he was also very insecure about the fact that he did use ghostwriters and did not want people to know that he used ghostwriters, even though he absolutely did. This is not speculation. We know this for a fact.
He was very sensitive to people pointing out that he was not the only writer involved in his creative works. This had recently been exposed in the press, specifically by the Journal des Débats.
By Louise's dad.
So the crowd is heckling and they're booing, which is a shame because at the same time, you also have people that are shouting for an encore. It's very mixed signals for the guy playing Quasimodo, Eugène Massol.
So the hecklers, were they heckling because they genuinely didn't think a woman could have written such a beautiful aria? They genuinely thought that Berlioz was hired by the Bertin family to ghostwrite the opera, or at least parts of it? Or were they heckling because they hated the newspaper published by Louise's father, they hated what it represented, they hated the establishment that it supported, and they just bought up tickets to this opera in order to take their frustration out on the publisher's daughter?
I see La Esmeralda as a bit of a Rorschach inkblot test, where anybody in the audience saw what they wanted to see. Some of the criticism feels very modern. You know, whenever a new movie comes out and it's got a female lead, people on the internet will complain like, oh, they put women in Ghostbusters, they ruined Ghostbusters. And then the movie comes out and they realize, oh, a bad script ruined Ghostbusters. Critics didn't like it much either. There's a really negative review written by an English critic who was passing by in Paris and stopped by because he heard that all of these performances were being booed and heckled. And this critic is named Henry Shorley. He watches the opera and then comes out and he says this: well, this just goes to prove the old adage, no woman hath a soul. At least as far as musical composition is concerned.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. Not to spend too much time on the soapbox, listener, but haven't you noticed that when a man fails spectacularly at something, the individual man is blamed, but when a woman fails spectacularly at something, women as a whole are blamed? Let's take stand-up comedy, for example. A man gets on stage, he bombs, everyone in the audience says, that guy shouldn't quit his day job. That sucked. A woman gets on stage and bombs, and the audience says, well, just goes to show women aren't funny. So I'm sure Louise didn't want to serve as a representative for her entire gender's capacity to compose beautiful music. You know, that's a huge burden. That's a ton of pressure. But she was. Unfortunately, just like we all are.
The opera only lasts 6 performances, which back then was extremely short. And even then, the last few performances get abridged. There were some talks about maybe revising the work and bringing it to another country. I think Germany.
Bring it to another country where no one knows who the Bertin family is or what they represent.
And Louise is so disheartened by the opera's failure that she never writes another opera again. She does still compose, but mostly in private. And she also takes up poetry. Really, the rest of her career is very isolated and sad. People called her a plagiarist, a nepo baby, all sorts of things. And the sad thing is, she did not plagiarize Quasimodo's aria. Berlioz did offer her a suggestion for the piece. He thought the ending should be more interesting, but that's not the same as I'm writing notes. And for 200 years, that sad fate has more or less been the legacy of La Esmeralda and Louise Bertin. But in the past couple of years, we've had a bit of a renaissance. There's been an increased interest in music written by women, not just in the present day, but during the Romantic and the Classical period as well. Louise Bertin has been rediscovered, and even though so many of her works were derided when they were new, people are a bit more sympathetic now. No one's going to say that she's the next Beethoven, but who is, right? You might even say that some of Louise's works are a hidden gem. La Esmeralda got a recording in 2008, as well as her opera based on Faust, which got a recording just in 2024, I believe. And La Esmeralda has seen new productions in the past few years, which are the first in, frankly, centuries. After 1836, the opera was done. In honor of Victor Hugo's 200th birthday, there was a simplified version that was played in Paris, and 20 years later, you got actual revivals with actual budgets that were produced throughout the city and even went on tour. I would have loved to have seen them. Now, of course, does that mean I love this work? We'll get into it.
And listener, speaking of that 2008 recording, that is available in its entirety for free on YouTube. So we will link to that in the show notes so that you can listen to it on your own if you'd like to hear this entire opera from beginning to end with English subtitles. But for now, let me summarize the plot, and then we'll talk about how it differs from Victor Hugo's original novel and the precedents it has set for future adaptations. The opera opens on the Court of Miracles, the shadowy haven of Paris's vagabonds, where a celebration is taking place. Hiding among the crowd is the alderman Claude Frollo, tormented by his desire for the beautiful Romani dancer Esmeralda. Clopin, the king of the beggars, and Frollo's student in sorcery, tips Frollo off that Esmeralda will be passing by alone, and with the help of his loyal servant, the deformed bell ringer Quasimodo, Frollo attempts to abduct her. But Captain Phoebus and his archers intervene. Frollo escapes while Quasimodo is captured. Esmeralda is instantly smitten with Phoebus, and during their flirtation, she takes a scarf from around his neck and puts it on. The next day, Quasimodo is publicly punished on the pillory, say that 5 times fast, while the crowd jeers at him. Esmeralda alone shows him mercy, climbing the pillory to offer him water. Later, at a party hosted by the mother of Phoebus's fiancé, Fleur-de-Lis, Esmeralda is invited to dance for the guests. Fleur-de-Lis spots her own handmade scarf around Esmeralda's shoulders and realizes Phoebus is in love with her. The party turns on Esmeralda, driving her out. Frollo, having overheard Phoebus boast about a rendezvous with Esmeralda, hides in the room where the two lovers meet. He lunges from behind a tapestry and stabs Phoebus with a dagger, then escapes through a window. Esmeralda is blamed for the attack and thrown in prison, believing Phoebus is dead. Frollo visits her cell the night before her execution, confesses his love, and offers to save her life if she'll choose him. Esmeralda asserts that she would rather die. The next day, at Esmeralda's execution before Notre Dame, Quasimodo leaps from the cathedral and carries Esmeralda inside, crying, "Sanctuary!" Frollo argues that the law of sanctuary does not protect Esmeralda because she is not a Christian, and he orders the archers to seize her. Before they can, Phoebus comes riding into the square and exposes Frollo as his true attacker. As the archers turn on Frollo, Esmeralda and Phoebus fall into each other's arms, but Phoebus's ride across the city has reopened his stab wound. He immediately dies in her arms, and Esmeralda throws herself onto his body and vows to follow him into eternity as the curtain falls.
That's mostly the novel. I mean, they had me in the first half.
Yeah, I recognize a ton of scenes from the novel. I recognize Frollo and Quasimodo attempting to kidnap Esmeralda, and Phoebus rushing in and flirting with Esmeralda while the archers tie up Quasimodo. I recognize Quasimodo's punishment on the pillory, and Esmeralda giving him water. I recognize Esmeralda being invited to dance for Phoebus's fiancé and her mother. I recognize Frollo stabbing Phoebus while he has a secret rendezvous with Esmeralda. I recognize Frollo visiting Esmeralda in her cell the night before her execution. I recognize the famous sanctuary scene, which is used in pretty much every notable adaptation of this novel. The bones of the novel are there. The meat on those bones, the new stuff, the revisions that were made for this opera specifically, they are full of glaring plot holes and deus ex machina moments, and unfortunately setups that never pay off. And I'm curious, Patrick, how much of that can be attributed to Hugo and Louise being forced to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite again on the order of government censors, and how much of that can be attributed to Victor Hugo as the person responsible for writing the words, just becoming uninterested after a while and phoning it in. Because my problems with this opera have nothing to do with the music, and we'll get into the music in a little bit. My problems have to do with the story and the words that tell that story.
I'm going to put a lot of the blame on Victor Hugo himself.
Yeah, very ironic, considering that it's his story that's being adapted here.
As for the ending, which is a bit of a cluttered mess,
Extremely rushed.
that I can contribute not so much to the government censors, but the opera house being stingy with the budget. There was supposed to be a fifth act.
Yeah, I was going to say, it feels like there is an entire plot beat that's missing here. In the novel, after Quasimodo carries Esmeralda into the church and yells "Sanctuary," there's a couple chapters where the two of them are in Notre Dame hanging out while he is taking care of her and giving her a bed and giving her food and water and clothes. So I feel as though that was supposed to be here, but it was ordered to be cut, and Hugo said, okay, whatever, let's, make it so that we have the famous sanctuary scene for the people who are fans of the book, but then it gets dashed immediately by something. I don't know, make something up. This is just my speculation. That's how we get Frollo saying, actually, the law of sanctuary does not protect a pagan. Seize her. And then Phoebus running in and saying, wait! Never mind, I'm alive! Oh, actually, I'm dead.
Those scenes between Quasimodo and Esmeralda were going to be in the fifth act, as well as, depending on which version of Hugo's plot synopsis we look at, because they are pretty different in the fifth act. One of them features the plot line with Esmeralda's long-lost mother, and another version has the assault on Notre Dame by the vagabonds.
Ah, the famous siege scene.
which would have been very expensive.
How cool would that be to see on stage? Unfortunately, and this is a problem we're going to run into with most of this novel's stage adaptations, a stage is limited in scale. You are limited to the however many square feet a stage is, whereas when you're making a movie, especially an animated movie, you can really build whatever you want, budget permitting, or you can draw whatever you want, budget permitting. A stage is a very, very limited space. So yeah, it would have been really cool to see the Siege of Notre Dame physically on stage, but how big was the stage? You know, would they even be able to show that if they had the budget for it?
So stuff like that was considered too expensive and too theatrical by the producers.
It's a theater! Of course it's supposed to be theatrical.
But they also did not like the actual ending of the novel, which Hugo has really detailed in his plot synopsis, both versions, because we have two that survive today. This is the scene from the novel where Claude Frollo watches Esmeralda's execution, he laughs, Quasimodo confronts him, and throws Frollo to his death. Most of the outlines are very vague. You know, a lot of times Hugo will write, this scene happens like it's in the book. You know, he's just writing a note for himself. But the scenes of the ending are very elaborate, which suggests Hugo really put a lot of thought into them. And the opera managers didn't like this ending. What, you can't just end this big grand opera on a guy getting pushed off a building? Where's the spectacle? And Hugo might say, I'm asking the same question. You keep telling me to cut the spectacle, and yet the ending is not exciting enough? With all those cuts and suggestions and contradictions, I think he got kind of lazy and just wrapped everything up at the end of Act 4 and tried to shove in about 200 pages of the novel into about a page and a half of the libretto.
Ironically, one of the most famous adaptations of a Victor Hugo novel, the Les Miserables stage musical, ends with a character falling to his death. Javert's suicide scene is an extremely important part of the ending of that musical. So it did end up happening eventually. We did end up getting that spectacle in an adaptation of a Victor Hugo novel, but not this one.
No, we don't have Broadway money. Even though we have all of the money in support of the government in theory, not so much in practice.
Government's pretty cheap.
My tax dollars are paying to have a scene where Captain Phoebus comes back on stage, proves Esmeralda innocent, and dies. Okay, so he's injured from Frollo stabbing him. He goes and gets healed a bit at Montfort, and then he comes back. However, riding on his horsey opens up his wound so bad that he dies immediately.
Hey, riding a horse is no joke. You cannot ride a horse if you're injured or still recovering from some kind of wound. It will reopen your stitches.
Says who?
Do you want me to text my friend who grew up riding horses right now?
Yeah.
Hey girl, I have a life or death question. So if I had been stabbed and my wound was stitched up, but I was still healing, and I got on a horse and rode a horse across an entire city, would that reopen my stab wound and be extremely dangerous for my health?
It would very likely reopen the stab wound. I don't know how deep the stab wound is, so I can't say how dangerous it is for your health. But yeah, definitely would reopen.
What if, like, I had a dagger sunk into my body, like, to the hilt? How dangerous would that be for me?
How vigorously are you riding the horse?
Like, very vigorously. Like, there's a beautiful maiden across the city who needs me to rescue her. You know the beginning of Shrek 2 when Prince Charming is riding the horse to Fiona's tower? Like that. Like that.
Oh yes, very dead. Very, very dead.
Okay, I would be very dead. Okay, all right, good. That's all we needed to know. Straight from the horse girl's mouth. If you ride a horse at top speed with a stitched up stab wound, you will be very dead. So her advice, don't. It does bear a small resemblance to the ending in Victor Hugo's novel. The book ends with Quasimodo cradling Esmeralda's corpse and eventually dying holding her. So they did end up together, but only in death. Likewise, in this opera, we see Phoebus collapse because his wound has been reopened, I guess, and die in Esmeralda's arms. And she throws herself onto him and says, "I will follow you into eternity." So I guess she dies of a broken heart. It's unclear. But yeah, I interpreted that as Esmeralda dying the same way that Quasimodo dies in the book. They can be together, but only in death.
Speaking of random parts of the novel that get shoved in,
oh, let's talk about them, because there's a lot.
My favorite is after Esmeralda dies or just decides she's going to kill herself or just give Phoebus' dead body a hug. It's not very clear. Claude Frollo shouts, "Fatality!" And the crowd also shouts, "Fatality!" And they're not talking about, like, Mortal Kombat moves. They're talking about a narc, right? Which is just mentioned at the very last line.
Yeah, in Victor Hugo's novel, this idea of fate, this idea that everything that happens to the characters is forced upon them by a higher power. Although I have my own opinions about whether that's actually true. Listener, if you haven't listened to our recap of the book, please go and do so. That is a theme that is introduced in the preface and is brought up time and time and time again throughout the novel from beginning to end. Here, like you said, Patrick, it's just mentioned once right before the curtain closes and never again in the opera. So if I'm an audience member in 1836 and I haven't read the novel because the opera house wasn't allowed to advertise that this opera was adapted from a best-selling novel, if I just go into the opera thinking it's a brand new show based on a brand new idea, and I hear the word fatality right before the curtain drops, I think, wait, what? Where's that coming from? Huh?
And speaking of huh, that's more or less my reaction to the character Clopin, the king of the beggars in this opera.
Yeah, in the book, Clopin is the leader of the vagabonds. He is antithetical to everything that Claude Frollo represents. He lives on the outskirts of society. He launches the siege on Notre-Dame. He is Esmeralda's, maybe not father figure, but sort of like a brother. He does refer to her as a sister in the novel. Here, he is Claude Frollo's student in sorcery for some reason. The idea of him learning magic from Frollo is mentioned once and never again. I don't think Frollo ever mentions that he knows sorcery, aside from that one moment where he's like, "Oh, here's my student in magic." Again, as a person who's never read the novel, I'm thinking, wait, what? Huh? Magic? Are we going to see some magic? No, we're not.
Now, in the novel, Claude Frollo is believed to be a magician.
Yeah, and he's trying to learn alchemy. He's trying to turn light into gold.
And he gets some pretty famous people he collaborates with. He even works with the King of France. But God, in this opera, he must have really lowered his prices, because now he's working with the King of the Beggars. I have no idea why Clopin is Claude Frollo's sidekick.
No idea, especially because Claude Frollo already has a sidekick in Quasimodo. Why does he need two? Also, Clopin has absolutely no role in this opera's climax. None whatsoever.
Well, he has no role in general. You know, the first chorus of the opera, the opening scene, is people praising Clopin, but he doesn't do anything. His role is to show up, talk to Frollo about schemes that never go through.
Never happen. Setups that never pay off.
and then disappear. In Act 1, he talks about helping Claude Frollo kidnap Esmeralda, and then he doesn't do it. Quasimodo helps, like in the novel. In Act 3, he offers to help with stalking and stabbing Captain Phoebus with all of his little beggar men. They don't do that. Frollo just stabs Phoebus like in the novel. And in Act 4, the final act, Clopin lets Claude Frollo know that Phoebus is alive. That's kind of a plot point. But first of all, I don't think that's good, because Phoebus being alive should come as a surprise to the audience, so it's a big twist. Instead, it's spoiled for us. And then Claude Frollo and Clopin's scheme, well, if Phoebus is alive, then we can decide if he shows up, you can come and get all your beggar guys and we can deal with Esmeralda ourselves. Mwahaha. And that never happens. He just disappears. I think Clopin could be cut and the story would be clearer. I don't know why Victor Hugo decided to boost Clopin's role and in such a meaningless way.
Right. And in a way that is antithetical to his character. I mean, as the king of the vagabonds, he is responsible for taking care of the vagabonds, making sure nobody trespasses on their little area, the Court of Miracles. Here, he's setting Esmeralda, one of his people, up to be abducted off the street. That doesn't sound like the Clopin I know from the novel.
Well, that's not the only change of characterization. Probably the biggest, and Hugo admits to this in his preface to the opera libretto, is with Captain Phoebus. His little preface begins, if by chance somebody is reminded of a novel while listening to an opera, so and so and so. The character of Phoebus de Chateaupert is one that had to be altered. You have to make changes when you are writing an adaptation. That's true. But Phoebus is pretty different than his novel counterpart, at least on paper. In the novel, Phoebus is a womanizing cad, and in the opera, he's also a womanizing cad who pressures Esmeralda and cheats on his fiancée, but he's framed as a romantic hero.
Yeah, he's fully cheating on his betrothed. We never see them breaking up officially, and the audience is still supposed to root for him? Okay.
His feelings for Esmeralda are sincere in this adaptation.
Whereas in the novel, he just wants to wham bam thank you ma'am.
This is a trend you're going to see in a lot of adaptations in the 19th century. But I wonder if a lot of the scenes between Phoebus and Esmeralda are relics from an early incarnation of the opera, where maybe Phoebus was more of a pervert and an exploiter, like he was in the book. I can't know that for certain, but in the novel, there are scenes where Phoebus is pressuring Esmeralda into, going all the way with him. And she resists that because she's concerned that if she loses her virginity, she will lose the magic power to find her parents.
Listener, if you haven't read the novel, it's very complicated, but she's kind of a little orphan Annie character in that she has this amulet that she believes is magic, and if she loses her virginity, the amulet will lose its magic powers. It's a little complicated, but in the novel, that is her strong, legitimate reason for wanting to hold on to her virtue and not wanting to go all the way with Phoebus, even though she is head over heels in love with him. In this opera, you're right, Patrick. She is very resistant to Phoebus's advances on her. She does not want him to come anywhere near him. She doesn't want to kiss him. She doesn't want him to touch her or caress her face. She doesn't want him to do anything with her. But there's no reason given. If she just has very strong boundaries, that's fine, but that's never explained. The amulet and the lost mother subplot is not here. And so Esmeralda resisting Phoebus's physical advances kind of comes out of nowhere. Again, it feels like there was a whole subplot that was cut.
That's because there was.
Cute.
Early drafts of the plot did have Esmeralda's mother, and we can speculate that the scenes of the amulet and Esmeralda not wanting to lose her virginity were part of that as well. But there is a lot of mystery to the composition of La Esmeralda, even more so than the writing of the novel. Speaking of characters who are different, what's going on with Quasimodo?
He's barely in this. Okay, first of all, the novel begins with the Parisians celebrating the Feast of Fools, which is a day to let loose and disregard the king and disregard rules and just go out into the street and cause mischief and have a grand old time. It's like the Purge, but less deadly. And during the Feast of Fools, a Pope of Fools, or a king for the day, is crowned. In the novel, Quasimodo is crowned the Pope of Fools. We see this happening. It's a fun scene. In this opera, we don't know what the vagabonds are celebrating. They're just celebrating something. And when Quasimodo shows up on stage, he has already been crowned the Pope of Fools, and the vagabonds are cheering, "Yay, Quasimodo, Pope of Fools." I'm sitting in the audience as someone who's never read the novel, and I'm thinking, wait, what the heck is the Pope of Fools? Who's this guy? What's going on? It's mentioned offhandedly that he is the bell ringer at Notre Dame, but it doesn't make sense that he would then be Claude Frollo's lackey, because in this version, Claude Frollo has nothing to do with Notre Dame. He's just an alderman, which is some kind of judge. So this is the origin of the idea of Judge Claude Frollo, the idea of Claude Frollo being a secular figure, but still someone with some authority that we are going to see fully realized in Disney's animated adaptation.
And he's mostly a passive character. A lot of Quasimodo's more important scenes, where he has dialogue rather than just being a mute character who is acted upon by others. He is crowned the Pope of Fools. He is ordered to kidnap Esmeralda. He's whipped and tormented in public. It's not until the second half of the novel where Quasimodo is an active character making his own choices. But most of those scenes would have been in the unwritten fifth act of the opera. We don't have those scenes, so Quasimodo really doesn't have much to do. Even in scenes where he is featured, he's either just responding to somebody else or acting in pantomime. During the big scene where he's whipped and tortured, all he says is water. Hugo could have used this opportunity to give Quasimodo a sad aria, which is a solo, talking about his pain of being humiliated. He doesn't do anything. The Pope of Fools scene, he just shows up and walks around and then apologizes to Frollo for doing some kind of blasphemy that we don't really understand. Quasimodo really doesn't get to shine as a character, except for one brief scene at the start of the fourth act, which is ultimately superfluous, but I'm going to agree with the critics and the haters back in 1836. Quasimodo's solo, the bell song, the air de cloche, is the best part. Not just musically, but in terms of Hugo's poetry as well. I think there are some very pretty lines throughout the libretto, but I think there are some lazy rhymes as well, right? But the air de cloche is very brief and simple. It's Quasimodo singing about how he loves Notre Dame and the beauty all around him, but doesn't love himself. He sings, "My God, I love, except for myself, everything in here." It's very beautiful and very Quasimodo, and it comes completely out of random. It doesn't affect the plot, and truly, you could have placed it anywhere within the opera. And musically, this is a really interesting piece that is appropriate to Quasimodo's character. I'm no music expert. Leslie, you have an actual music education, at least when it comes to singing. But would I be crazy? Because I'm looking at the actual sheet music, and I know very little about composition and music theory. I know a few basics. I noticed the time signature for Quasimodo's aria is in 2/4, which allows for 2 beats for every measure of music. And to me, listening to the recordings of this opera and looking at the sheet music, I see 2 beats for measure, and you know what I think? Ding dong.
Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. Yeah, absolutely.
So the bell ringer's song sounds like a bell. That is a really appropriate an interesting and fun creative choice. This is a very energetic piece. It's sad, it's beautiful, it has all of the wonderful contradictions of Quasimodo as a character, and I think it's best enjoyed in isolation. So if you hear nothing at all from this opera, please seek out the Air de Cloche.
Well, that's why I said my gripes with this adaptation have nothing to do with the music itself and everything to do with the story. You know, it's not just the music for Quasimodo's aria that do a great job of conveying the story. I think maybe even more so than the words do. Esmeralda's music, and not just the music she sings, but the music people use to describe her. It's very light and very agile and fluttery. It moves very, very fast and very, very easily. You know, Esmeralda is compared to a bird in Victor Hugo's novel. Louise Bertin is borrowing that element and making her music sound very fluttery and bird-like. By contrast, Claude Frollo's music is very deep and rumbly and languid. He, stays on the same note for a while, really, really deep in his register. What is that reflecting? That Claude Frollo feels as though Esmeralda has dragged him down to the depths of despair. Even more so, he sings a lot of descending scales, and there are a lot of descending scales in the orchestration underneath his solos and his appearances on stage. What does that convey? He feels his lust for Esmeralda is dragging him down to hell, morally and spiritually. The music does a fantastic job of telling the story and telling us as the audience how we should feel about these characters before a single word has been sung. That is the hallmark of a great composer.
Berlioz thought that Louise had the potential to be a great composer. He wrote a review defending her and defending Esmeralda as a work. And this wasn't just him fighting against the accusations of being a ghostwriter and Louise being a plagiarist. He saw a lot of talent within her. And while this is not the greatest opera ever, it is the sign of somebody who put a lot of thought into their work.
She's clearly received a great education. She is clearly immensely talented. Like you said, Patrick, she is clearly extremely hardworking. Ironically, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think what got her that education, her father being very wealthy and well-to-do and hooking her up with these great professors and getting the greatest singers in Paris to perform her work. What she can attribute her education to, her family, ultimately ended up being the factor that led to this opera's downfall. People bought up tickets to this opera just to show up and take out their anger toward her father's newspaper and the government it supported on the opera. It's funny how sexists are able to hold multiple contradictory opinions at the same time and draw on whichever one best serves their argument in the moment. This opera is terrible. Of course it's terrible. It was written by a woman. Oh, but if it is good, it was written by a man. Those are two contradictory statements. Just pick one and stick with it. But the people who were hating on this opera, they didn't care about being logically consistent. They just cared about being hateful.
So being a Nepo baby got Louise's foot in the door, but it wasn't able to stop a mob from stamping on that foot. If you're not overly familiar with opera, I think La Esmeralda, flaws and all, is a pretty good introduction. This is an opera written before the works of Giuseppe Verdi or Richard Wagner. There aren't as much of a focus on character themes as I personally would like. Esmeralda is the only character that has a theme here. Do 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 do. Right, very light and airy. I think we could have benefited from giving Captain Phoebus or Claude Frollo a theme. All of the contradictions and the censorship that forced this to be 4 acts instead of 5, well, that results in this opera being just a little over 2 hours.
Which is about the length of the average musical today.
If you listen to other grand operas from the 1830s, like those of Meyerbeer, I hope you have 5 hours on your hands.
Oh my gosh, please let me get up and go do something with my life. Why am I wasting 5 hours watching this opera?
Well, to be fair, that kind of was the attitude at the time historically. Like last year, the CEO of Netflix came out with a statement saying that he wants to produce second screen first content. Basically, shows and movies to watch while you're on your phone half paying attention, that constantly tell you what's going on so that you don't get lost. That's kind of what grand opera was. I think there are a lot of grand operas that are worth revisiting and enjoying, maybe with some bathroom breaks. But if a piece is 5 hours, most people were not paying attention the entire time. They were walking in and out of the theater, they were making out, they were getting snacks, they were leaving to go pee, they were showing up an hour and a half late, and they still figured out what was going on. Esmeralda, by contrast, is 2 hours. There's no real fat or filler here, unless you want to count all the annoying contradictory subplots with Clopin, but hey, if I was directing a production, I think I would cut him entirely. You could save maybe 10 minutes of not really exceptional music. This could be a good introductory opera, and it's certainly the most melodic and pleasant to listen to of all of the Notre-Dame de Paris operas that we'll be covering on this show.
We've spoken a little bit about this opera's legacy and how it influenced future adaptations, starting with making Claude Frollo a secular character rather than a member of the clergy. We talked about how Phoebus's feelings for Esmeralda in this adaptation are genuine, and we're going to see that in future adaptations. This is also the adaptation that introduces a scarf as a symbol of affections. Here we have Esmeralda stealing Phoebus's scarf off of his shoulders that was knit for him by fleur-de-lis. So it's a symbol of Phoebus's affections changing hands, going from fleur-de-lis to Esmeralda. We're also going to see a scarf come up in the Disney movie when Claude Frollo sees the scarf as a symbol of his lust for Esmeralda.
We'll get to this when we eventually cover the 1844 ballet, which is still popularly performed today, especially in Eastern Europe. But that version takes Hugo's libretto and fixes it. Instead of having the confused jumble of a semi-tragic, semi-happy ending, like we have here, it just gives a happy ending. Phoebus comes back from his journey, says Frollo's guilty, Frollo's arrested, and he and Esmeralda end up happily ever after. So listener, I really advocate, give it a try. You may not love it, but there are parts to like here. And really, let's look for some diamonds in the rough, some hidden gems amidst the hate.
All right, Pat, now that we've come to the end of our discussion, what are your overall thoughts on Louise Bertin and Victor Hugo's La Esmeralda?
Well, if I was just reviewing Hugo's libretto, I would say it's worth skimming for fans of the novel who want to get some insight into maybe how Hugo sees his characters, even with the changes to the source material. There are some occasional interesting poetic flourishes, particularly with Claude Frollo and Quasimodo in their brief scenes. But there are a lot of cheap rhymes in the original French and a few parts where you can tell that Hugo phoned it in. So it's a curiosity, but not essential, and not nearly of the quality of the original novel. Though other composers were inspired by Hugo's libretto because it was published with his complete works and adapted it into operas of their own, which are also forgotten today. I think La Esmeralda is worth revisiting almost solely because of Louise Bertin. It's not just a curiosity because there is not a lot of music and especially complete operas written by women during this time. It has some worthwhile pieces of its own. Aside from Quasimodo's Bell Song, I also really like Claude Frollo's aria in Act 1, where he's lamenting his obsession for Esmeralda. I really like the choruses during the pillory scene and the opening chorus where the vagabonds are praising Clopin. I like the trio during Act 3 between Esmeralda, Claude Frollo, and Phoebus. And I also really like the kind of twisted choice. And I don't know if this came from Bertin directly or from Hugo, because it's not suggested by the libretto. But in Act 4, when the crowd is preparing to enjoy Esmeralda's execution, they're talking about how, oh, Notre Dame will get a sight of the young girl who dies tonight. It's very grim and somber in the text, but Louise's music turns it into a fun carnival atmosphere. Like, oh boy, we're going to watch a girl die, which has a very dark irony to it that I quite enjoy. And I can't think of any real duds or lulls in the score, but those are the highlights for me. Now, what are your overall thoughts, Leslie?
I completely agree with your assertion that this would be a very good first opera, especially as a relic from the French grand opera period. These works that were typically 5 acts, 5 hours long, a bajillion characters that constantly over-explain what's happening in the story. I think this is a very digestible length. It is easy to follow, especially if you watch the 2008 recording on YouTube that has English subtitles. And again, listener, I'm going to link to that in the show notes. It's very difficult to judge operas the way we have chosen to judge them. We just spent however many dozens of minutes tearing all of the plot holes and Deus Ex Machina moments apart. Those are not totally uncommon in operas. An opera is not the way a lot of 21st century viewers would describe them as it's a musical, but there's no dialogue. You know, that's not it. An opera is not about the story, although a compelling story is important. An opera is about the voices. When you walk out of a musical, you'll say, oh my gosh, wasn't that a fantastic story? But when you walk out of an opera, you'll say, oh my gosh, wasn't the soprano fantastic? God, what a voice. You're featuring the voices first and foremost, and because of that, the plot elements that we just spent however many minutes ripping apart, those gaping plot holes, characters that don't really serve a functional purpose in the end, Deus Ex Machina moments, oh my gosh, Phoebus just kind of shows up on a horse and then exposes Frollo as the attacker and then immediately dies, blah, blah, blah. Those are more excusable in operas than musicals, because as long as the soprano is singing like the rent is due, the audience can excuse a lot of those elements we just spent some time ripping apart. I mean, the end of one of the most famous operas of all time, Mozart's The Magic Flute, features the primary antagonist, the Queen of the Night, appearing on stage and then kind of just running off. And her defeat can be implied through staging, but there's really no rational explanation for what happens to her or why she runs away or why she is defeated. It's just not in the music. But it doesn't matter because the music is just so good. All that is to say, the way that we have been assessing this opera might be unfair. It might be a little too harsh for an opera. We might be putting way too much emphasis on the story and the words. Again, like Patrick said, in an opera collaboration, the composer always takes precedence over the librettist. The librettist is second fiddle. So we might have been completely incorrect in our assessment of this work. Regardless, I think the music is phenomenal. I would really like to see a better story to support the music. And listener, I really hope, especially if you've never listened to an opera before, I really hope that you take the time to turn this one on and to listen to it. If for no other reason than that the music is pretty and that Louise Bertin was treated so unfairly in her time. And I'm so happy to see opera houses revisiting her work, if for no other reason than, oh crap, we've never produced an opera by a female composer before. We have to do that now.
Oh, and by the way, Victor Hugo wrote the libretto, so there's your marketing.
Pat, before we say goodbye here, it's time for our game that we like to play at the end of every episode. So, out of everyone and everything we have discussed today, who or what would you A, meet at the inn, B, turn to dust with, and C, throw off of Notre Dame?
I am going to meet Fleur-de-Lis's mother at the inn. She is a very minor role. She only appears for a couple of scenes in Act 2 and then never again. But she has a line that I'm really amused by. In that scene, Phoebus and Fleur-de-Lis are bickering because Fleur-de-Lis rightly suspects that Phoebus is not really in love with her and that he is in love with another woman. And Madame de Gondelaurier, Fleur's mother, says, "Oh, stop bickering. You guys can quarrel after you get married," which I find very funny and silly. I will be turning to dust with this version of Esmeralda, who is a bit more street smart and aware than her novel counterpart, who was a very innocent and naive character. And, she's willing to follow Phoebus into eternity, whatever that means. If that means she dies of a broken heart or commits suicide, or just, hey, I'm going to meet you later, I'll die when I'm like 90, I'll follow her into eternity as well. And as for who I'm throwing off of Notre Dame, I would be very surprised if your answer is different, Leslie. I will be throwing this version of Clopin off of Notre Dame. I think the libretto would be so much cleaner if he was eliminated. And if I were directing a production, I would cut him. He doesn't have any notable musical numbers that are worthy of keeping, so the opera doesn't suffer immensely if you lose him. Quasimodo plays a largely superfluous role, but his bell aria is so pretty and beautiful that the opera would be worse without it. Clopin mostly has recitative, which is an opera term for sung-through dialogue. So if that's cut, you're not missing a ton. So Clopin just frustrates me by trying to be Frollo's sidekick and not doing anything. So who's your lucky three, Leslie?
I wouldn't say all of them are lucky. I went in a completely different direction with mine. I am going to meet Hector Berlioz at the inn because I think he took this whole disaster in stride. He had a good face about it. He ran rehearsals to the best of his ability. He gave Louise Bertin advice. He published a positive review of the opera. He did his best to salvage the opera's image as best as he could, and he could have taken credit for Quasimodo's aria. Once he heard everybody stand up and say, "Oh, it's not by Louise Bertin, it's by Berlioz. This aria's so good, it couldn't possibly be written by a woman," he could have taken credit for that. He could have said, "Yeah, guys, that was me. Look, aren't I awesome?" But he didn't. Instead, he chose to bow out respectfully and turn to Louise Bertin and say, "Hey, I'm going to help you as much as I possibly can here. I'll publish a positive review. I'll give you advice. I'll continue to be a friend to you." I really respect him being the good guy in that situation, and I would like to take him to the inn. I would love to go on a date with Mr. Berlioz. I am going to turn to dust with Louise Bertin herself. I admire her commitment to this project. I admire her enthusiasm. Her anxiety about it breaks my heart. She felt like she was being attacked from all sides. People were putting so much pressure on her. And as the person she turns to dust with, I like to think that I would be a very supportive companion for her. I think that's what she needed, ultimately. I think that's why she reached out to Victor Hugo and said, please help me, because she needed a supportive companion who was willing to give her advice and hold her up and make sure that she was taken care of at the end of a long day. So, just out of sympathy, I will be that person to Louise Bertin. And we only mentioned him briefly, but I am going to throw the author of the Three Musketeers, Alexandre Dumas, off of Notre Dame to quote the Bible. I hate that whiny baby. Oh my gosh. Like, just put yourself in his shoes for 2 seconds. Hey, I use ghostwriters. I don't pay them royalties. I am extremely embarrassed by the fact that I use ghostwriters, but not embarrassed enough to write my own novels. And here is this newspaper that published a piece in which I am called out for using ghostwriters, even though it's true. So in retaliation, I am going to buy a ticket to the opera written by the daughter of the newspaper publisher, not the person who wrote the article, the daughter of the person who published the article, and I am going to stand up in the middle of the performance and, in retaliation for something she didn't do, falsely accuse her of using a ghostwriter. Does that sound fair to you, Patrick? Does that sound like fair retribution?
No, you're missing the mark.
Yeah, I have no plans to read The Three Musketeers, and I probably never will, considering that it was not written by a man who did not compensate his ghostwriters fairly and was super whiny and took out his frustration on women who did not deserve it. But you know what? Sometimes you have to deal with the haters and the critics. Our friend Quasimodo certainly dealt with quite a few haters and critics. And we will continue to talk about the way this character is adapted on the stage and on the screen in future episodes.
And tune in next week for our special interview with Dr. Denise Boneau, all about Louise Bertin's legacy.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Hunchcast. Ring that notification bell to be automatically updated when new episodes are released. For free bonus content, and to share your thoughts with us, follow us on Instagram, Tumblr, and TikTok at The Hunchcast. The Hunchcast of Notre Dame is a production of 1482 Media. All rights reserved.